Hey everyone, so a lot of you guys were asking me yesterday, hey, where's the footage of these rotations? Can I see how you're doing it? Today, we're going to be showing you guys footage of every single rotation in the ranking/graphing tabs. A lot of you guys were also asking me for loadouts. All of the loadouts that I used in these damage rotations are available as dim links on the right side of the ranking tab. If there's two loadouts that I swap between mid damage, both of those loadouts are going to be available. So check out any aspects, fragments, weapons I use. It's all going to be there so that you can try these damage rotations yourself. Now, as for the actual damage rotations we're going over today, we're going to be going from lowest DPS to highest DPS at the end of the video. And of course, the buffs, debuffs, and stuff like that, very simple. It's just Well of Radiance and optimal surges. That's all that's being used. No artifact mods, so no Argent Ordnance, no Solo Operative, no Revitalizing Blast, nothing like that. It's just going to be raw Well of Radiance. The rocket rotations do have Gjally included, and there are maybe 1, 2, or 3 rotations that use Lumina or Tractor as part of the rotation. Now those rotations, the Tractor debuff is included, obviously, because I need to damage the boss with Tractor. And if I'm using Lumina in a rotation to help buff my teammates, I'm going to simulate using Lumina. So I will in fact have a 35% buff for that rotation. And when we get to those rotations, I will mention that and remind you guys that that is happening. But by default, assume it is just Well of Radiance and matching surges. So with that in mind, let's get on with the video. Alright, to start us off at around 74,000 DPS, we have Retrofit Escapade. Now, I've tried a variety of options with Retrofit Escapade, whether it's Gerfalcons or Orpheus and spamming Tether in between mags. It ended up being, the best option to keep target lock up as much as possible was Actium Warrig Titan. So naturally, I was like, okay, what's the best damage super you can have on Titan? It's either Curus or Pyrogale. And you'll notice the other Titan machine gun rotation that I used in this video is going to be, of course, Thunderlord. And I went with Actium Warrig there as well. And I started with Pyrogale Gauntlets. So Pyrogale Gauntlets, got 3 Roaring Flame stacks, dumped my Consecration Burning Maul super on the boss. I jumped up to the well and basically just dumped my mag until the boss was dead. Now, a surprising thing about this rotation, like I said in my previous video, it does significantly less total damage than I expected, so I will be revising my retrofit single numbers in the future. And one more thing is you'll notice at the end of this rotation, there's a massive chunk of damage, around 800,000 damage is done to the boss after I stop shooting. Now, this is something I've noticed with a variety of high fire rate and high instance count weapons, whether we're talking Pack Hunter rockets, whether we're talking a high fire rate machine gun like Thunderlord or Retrofit Escapade. You'll see here as the rotation winds down, there's a big chunk at the end. Next up, we have the other machine gun rotation, which is basically more the same thing. It's just Thunderlord instead. Those of you that remember, I was doing Thunderlord testing on the Grasp of Avarice Ogre in the past. Whenever I Icarus dash to reload Thunderlord because I wasn't using Actium Warrig, there would be a big chunk on the boss, and this doesn't change on here as well, even if I'm on Titan. At the end of the damage phase, you'll see that there's like a big spike in damage to the health bar. But besides that, nothing crazy here, just Arc Surges, Well of Radiance, and of course me spamming my Thunderlord to my heart's content using Actium Warrig until I am completely out of ammo. Now, this actually doesn't have that different of a DPS value compared to Retrofit, but obviously has a much lower total damage value given that there's no target lock and no 4 times a charm. And so coming up, we have what is arguably our first real rotation, as in you're using 3 different weapons. We have a Nighthawk swap into Foetracer along with Witherhoard, Empty Vessel, and 4 times a charm bait and switch Cataclysmic. Now, this rotation, it's a little special, right? Obviously, I'm using Thermite Grenade to reproc Foetracer and use Ember of Singeing to get my dodge back faster. I'm not using any sort of dodge assist exotic here, so no Radiant Dance Machines, no 6 Coyote, so being able to get that dodge back very quickly using stuff like Throwing Knife and Thermite is really important to make sure I have maximum Cataclysmic uptime. Now, you'll notice here another special thing that I'm doing is I'm actually getting 3 4 times a charm procs per mag. And the way that you do that is you have to be very fast. You have to shoot your last 2 shots in your mag, quickly reload dodge and Witherhoard Empty Vessel, and then your first 2 shots of the next mag are actually going to count towards 4 times a charm, which increases the total damage of this rotation substantially. Next up, we have the only sword rotation on this list, and that's going to be Nighthawk, Foetracer, Lament. Now, the reason why the footage you're seeing here is on Avarok instead of Templar is because aerial tracking on Lament on an airborne target like Templar is horrible. So I just decided to go for a 2 light, 1 heavy, 1 regular swing combo with 3 loosened blades, the classic, good total damage, and a balance of DPS. Now, if you're wondering why the total damage in the top right is so low, it's because I only limited myself to the grasp damage phase, which is of course only 30 seconds. On a boss like Templar with a longer phase, we would have been able to squeeze out more, but you can extrapolate. Next up, we have the only Gjally rotation on this list, and that's going to be double pellet Gjally. Now, admittedly, this rotation is quite a bit sloppy, but I just wanted some Gjally representation on this list from something half decent. Probably next season when I revisit this damage ranking and end up having to redo all these rotations anyway, I will likely redo this with a much more optimal setup, using something like Lucky Pants perhaps. But yeah, this is just an example of a Gjally rotation where the user is doing a fair bit of damage and trying to get their reload dodge back fast using Ember of Singeing and the Dragon's Shadow. Next, we have the strongest linear in the game, which is of course Briar's Contempt with Enhanced Surrounded. This thing has a 47% damage buff, and of course it also has rewind rounds, which allows you to dump its entire reserves with just one reload assist like a reload dodge. Here I opted for a Nighthawk into Foetracer swap for obvious reasons, and I'm basically just spamming ammo into the boss's crit. I'm reprocking Foetracer, and I'm reload dodging to dump the rest of my reserves. And unfortunately, linear's not a very impressive showing, even with a 47% damage buff. Total damage not that impressive, and of course when you're comparing it against on the DPS field, it's a lot worse. Next up, we have a surprise contender in 1000 Voices. Now, 1000 Voices with its reserve buff to 12 total shots, this thing actually has fairly decent total damage for an exotic heavy at 2.6 million, and the DPS is not too bad either, sitting at around 100k. Now, the only problem with 1000 Voices with Ember of Ashes causing ignitions every shot is that you can't really stack this that well in a team setting, because the ignition is actually a fairly significant portion of the damage, and if only one person can get ignitions all the time, it's not that great. Leviathan's Breath is up next, and while I used to recommend this option to LFGs as like a simple DPS option that people can spam in teams, unlike stuff like 1k and Dragon's Breath, the problem with this weapon is that not only do you need kind of void loaders and void targeting, and I have Oathkeeper on in this case as well, and Lunafaction Well to kind of get it going, but it's kind of been outclassed. Bungie has buffed Whisper of the Worm repeatedly, their favorite child, and it's going to be receiving the global sniper buff next season, which will only make Levy Breath look worse. Speaking of which, we have Whisper of the Worm next, and you can see the total damage difference is absolutely crazy. This thing is front-loaded with a Nighthawk into a Foetracer swap. I never actually reproc Foetracer because that would mean having to cut down on Whispered Breathing uptime, so I just continue to shoot the boss here, and I keep my triple Solar Surge rather than quad Solar Surges for the rest of the damage phase. Now, if you're looking for a consistent damage option that does decent DPS over a very long period of time, does good total damage, Whisper of the Worm is your friend. It has basically completely replaced the role of every other precision weapon in the game when it comes to total, consistent, sustained DPS, something linears could only dream of doing. Double pellet Parasite is up next. Now, this is one of those rotations that kind of crops up from time to time. I get my curiosities about it, see if it's any good. Obviously, shotguns are getting a tiny bit of a buff relative to where they are right now next season. That being said, you know, despite the fact that this kind of abuses worm byproduct to spam special ammo DPS into a boss, it's still actually not that great overall. I might actually remove it from this list next season. As I mentioned to you guys earlier, every single season I'm going to be removing rotations that I think are kind of irrelevant and keeping ones that I think are relevant in the mix. Next up, we have Witherhoard 140 Cascade Deconstruct Edge Transit. Now, this is one of many Rain of Fire rotations that I tested with various versions of Edge Transit. This one specifically is Cascade Deconstruct. You can see I Witherhoard stick the boss and stick the ground every other cycle to maximize my DPS here, so I get stick and ground damage as well. You can see Deconstruct, the biggest issue here is that on bosses that move, it tends to stick to them and not really proc, so I try to dash and reload kind of late, so my sticky grenades have the chance to blow up. Next up, we have the only tractor rotation on the list, which is going to be double slug tractor. We just start off with a Nighthawk and a backup mag swap so that my assault mag shotguns can have, I believe it is 14 in the mag, and then I shoot 7 of each, right? So once I hit 7, I'm going to switch back to tractor, then I keep dumping them. So I swap from backup mag into boss spec. And then once I'm done dumping all of these, I simply do a nice little reload dodge, right? And then I go back to slugging. And once one of my slugs are out, I just do 2-3 swaps with Nessa and Tractor. And that's all she wrote. That's going to be the DPS for double slug Tractor. Next up, we have the Izi variant of the Witherhoard 140 Deconstruct rotation. Now, you'll notice here that the Deconstruct total damage values of these rotations is actually not that high. And that's because these sticky grenades on bosses that are moving, even bosses like Templar, have trouble detonating instantly and really proccing that Deconstruct quickly. So you'll notice I tried to use my Icarus dash late to give my stickies time to detonate to mitigate this effect, but it still happens anyway. This rotation, really the only difference between it and Witherhoard is that I front load with an Izi, and then I just use 140 sniper at the end of every single cycle to reproc Cascade. Next up, we have Izi GL Apex Apotheosis. Now, this rotation is just the classic Izi GL Apex combo, but with demo, bait and switch, and Threat of Ascent threadling grenade spam using Apotheosis super effect. Now, the problem here is, I didn't do this rotation perfectly, right? I did some manual reloads instead of doing grenade rocket spamming, but I have tested this rotation in the past with perfect timings, and it's not very good compared to something like Necrotic. So it is an option, but I'm probably not going to retest this again. I don't think it's very good, and we'll probably just move on. Next up, we have Verity's Apex. Now, this rotation just spams double damage fusion grenades using Verity's Brow. Ariana's Vow is just there to get bait procs as well as to refill on death row stacks. And as you can see, some people in my chat were calling this the random bullshit go rotation. I didn't really have any plan going into this rotation. I just spam Mountaintop and Apex whenever they were reloaded, and I would just dump snaps and fusion grenades anytime I had them into the boss. It is really the random bullshit go rotation, but the DPS actually isn't that bad, and the total damage is obviously very respectable, given that you're supplementing your damage with a lot of ×5 fusion grenades. So yeah, just sit back, enjoy, and watch the random bullshit go rotation finish. Coming up next, we have a Hunter Classic, and that's going to be, of course, Izi GL Apex with the Dragon's Shadow. Now, those of you who aren't aware, you can actually shoot 3 rockets in a row on the Dragon's Shadow by shooting your rocket in the middle of your dodge, and then Dragon's Shadow actually changes your dodge so that you get another reload at the end of your dodge. So you initiate a manual reload like so, you shoot while you're dodging, and then at the end of your dodge, you get another rocket back. Now, since you shoot so many rockets here, you actually limit the amount of Izis that you shoot, so the total damage is not great, but the DPS is pretty decent. Next, we have another Izi GL Apex rotation. This time it's going to be on Rain of Fire, so no damage super here. You're going to be on Well. We pop Heat Rises to get 2 dashes off. We can shoot 4 rockets in a row at the start, and we're just finishing off with, GL Izi, rocket, dash, rocket, dash, rocket. Total damage here, not looking too great, but the DPS is fairly decent given that you have, no damage super, no Nighthawk, nothing like that. Next up, we have Legend of Acrius. Now, Legend of Acrius was incredibly annoying to test on Templar, so I decided to find a boss with the identical scaler, but a little bit easier of a time doing some melee range DPS. Now, the stomp timings did have to be a little bit calculated for here, but besides that, I'm using Necrotic Grip to proc Trench Barrel using my needle melees from time to time, also applying a little bit of Unravel, and I'm just kind of dumping my ammo from start to finish until I'm completely out. So as you can see here, we got our last shot in, boom, and DPS is over. We have another Hunter Classic coming up here, and that is, of course, Izi GL Apex Foetracer. Now, Foetracer gives me 4 solar surges, which means I'm running 3 kinetic surges this entire time. This increases my total damage by a lot because I'm running 3-4 rather than 3-0 or, 2-1 surges. And I'm not spamming my dodge or spamming my rocket as much, which means I get a lot more Izi mileage out of this rotation as well, which increases the total damage to 3.73 million. This next rotation is Witherhoard Cartesian Apex. A lot of people were asking me to compare this to Izi GL, and you'll see that the total damage despite using Witherhoard is in fact worse than Izi GL, and the DPS is, substantially worse as well. Now, is it horrible? Certainly not. It's a decent option. It's in the middle of the list for a reason, but you'll see as we get to the later rotations that some of the big boy rotations really do tend to put these to shame. Now, this next rotation is the first one that uses a Cascade Bait Edge Transit rather than a Cascade Deconstruct Edge Transit, and you'll see that the total damage does take a little bit of a hit for that, but it's not that bad, and in the future, you'll see that it only goes up from here for Edge Transit. So around here is where I would say we are crossing into the territory of rotations I would actually consider to be good or meta or usable. So this first one is the classic. It's just Envious bait and switch dumping. I have 24 in my mag going into damage, and I'm just dumping until my bait and switch timer is just about to run out. Then I do a reload knife using Sealed Amkara Grasps, I reproc bait, and I dump the rest of my ammo, which of course ends up being decent DPS and decent total. Now, this rotation is a modification of the Warden's Law Chicken SI2 rotation that uses Malfeasance instead. I got a friend to stick the boss with Witherhoard from me, and then I recorded the DPS of Witherhoard alone and subtracted it from the rotation, and you'll see here that it's surprisingly not that great. You'll see the Warden's Law rotation, it has higher DPS and almost similar total damage values. So, Malfeasance, it's pretty decent, of course, and, abusing Whisper of Rending is still very good with it. but it's not as great as one might expect, given that, you know, Witherhoard sticking a boss and using Malfeasance is a huge DPS boost. I used to get asked all the time if Double Slug or Izi GL was better, so I tend to include Double Slug Apex or Double Slug Rocket in my rotation videos as a comparison point. Now, it's not too bad, and the total damage isn't too bad, but you know, Izi GL is still going to reign supreme here, but of course, you can watch the rotation if you're curious as to what a Double Slug rotation looks like in Season of the Wish right before the final shape. It's 6 Slug, 1 Rocket. Now, if you've been watching our King's Fall speedruns, you've probably seen us use this one on War Priest. Lumina Cold Comfort is for all of the Lumina users out there, so it does include the 35% buff just to me. And this one is pretty straightforward. It just uses Necrotic Grip with Needle Storm, you know, the classic. Not too much total damage since you're basically only doing rocket damage plus a Needle Storm with this rotation. And yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Not much else to say about that. Now, this one is going to be the last Well of Radiance / Rain of Fire rotation we have on this list, and it's basically the Witherhoard version of the Izi 140 Cascade Bait Edge Transit rotation. So this one just dumps a Witherhoard every single mag on every single cycle. Pretty straightforward, and then also shoots 2 140 Sniper to activate Cascade. Coming up next, we have the Chicken SI2 rotation. Shout out to him for that. This is the Warden's Edge rotation using Whisper of Rending to really abuse that frozen multiplier on primary weapons. Now, this one did take me a couple attempts to get right, but I do think that this clip that you're seeing right now is the perfect reenactment of this DPS rotation. Everything hit perfectly, nice tight timings as well. And as you can see, as a result, 3.8 million total damage, very high, and a solid 140k DPS as well. Whenever we talk about heavy GLs, this is a commonly requested one, Enhanced Surrounded Koraxis with Envious Assassin. As you can see, it's basically just getting surrounded, shooting one Izi after your Goldie, and absolutely dumping your heavy GL. I use Radiant Dance Machines here to help me out and get me a couple extra dodges off so I can reload with 5 in the mag, and of course I backup mag swap in order to get that much in the mag to begin with. Shout out to Verity in my Twitch chat for asking me to do this one. I was going to do it next season as I'd kind of run out of time this season, but I felt that this list would be kind of incomplete if I didn't include this. Now, this is a version of the Izi Nessa Edge rotation that I've been saying has been really good on stream that was originally made for Warlock, but I decided to make one for Hunter as well that uses Sealed Omkara Grasps. A little bit less optimal, but it's still very good. As you can see, good total damage, good DPS, and yeah, I had a blast recording it. Next up, we have the original core rotation, let's call it, Izi GL Apex Necrotic. I've been recommending this thing for a long time, for like a couple seasons now. This thing is absolutely fantastic, and yeah, not much to say about this one. Great DPS, decent total damage, but it's about to be surpassed, and you'll see why in just a second by the very next rotation on this list. And that is, of course, going to be Izi Nessa Edge Necrotic. Now, this is basically the core rotation that I think is going to take the final shape by storm, assuming no other weapon meta changes happen. This is just a fantastic rotation. You can do it on any strand subclass. Obviously, on Titan, you have access to Blade Fury, which is not great, and on Hunter, you have access to Silk Strike, also not great. But it's a very easy rotation to pull off, and Threat of Ascent is very consistent, so you'll always get a reload off on time. Someone in my chat also asked me to test out Supremacy with Wilderflight for the Cascade BnS Edge Transit rotation, and obviously you can see since we're not using Izi, the DPS is higher, but the total damage does suffer, which is what you'd expect from a rotation like this where you don't have a really powerhouse special weapon to fill out that missing total damage. This one's a classic, again, just Cold Comfort, Radiant Dance Machines dumping. Start with a Goldie, switch to Radiant Dance Machines, make sure you have Envious Assassin Restoration Ritual, and then you're just dumping 10 rockets in a row into the boss, over and over and over and over and over. Right, you start to run out of bait at the very end here, but yeah, that's pretty much it. Low total damage. Listen, you knew it was coming, I knew it was coming. We got grapple melees on the list. This one's Synthos. Of course, we also have Worm God later on down the list. Now, some of you were asking me in the comments, yo, why not Winter's Guile? Why not Verity's Brow? I heard those were good. Verity's Brow only boosts grapple melee damage by 2 times. Worm God is up to 3.75 times, which is a lot more. And then Winter's Guile is kind of just a worse version of grapple melee on Titan because you don't have Banner of War, and also the timer is a lot more restrictive. So enjoy Synthos. Obviously total damage is technically infinite, so I just ended up killing the boss. And the DPS is pretty good as well, right? 171k. I had Biotic for basically the whole time. I messed up a little bit here and there, but for the most part, it was pretty good, pretty fast. My teammates healing me with an Assembler Rift and some healing grenades, and the boss is dead. Now this next one, well, watch it. You'll see what happens. Yeah, this is probably the most camera flicking I've ever done for any D2 rotation ever. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm using a slide shots around a crux and rapidly sliding into a wall, into a corner next to me, so I can repeatedly proc slide shot, shoot the aggressive rocket at max fire rate. When I'm done with that, I have triple arc reserve, so I dump 4 horseman mags using Radiant Dance Machines. Now this next rotation is kind of low total damage, but it's one of 2 rotations that uses a huge amount of burst damage at the start of the rotation, swaps to a completely different loadout with Horseman and a Cascade bait and switch Edge Transit, and so basically you just get 1 mag of it towards the end to extend your total damage. Now this next rotation, which was cooked up by Concluso, I'm going to call Horseman Impetus Edge. Now, this rotation, what surprised me the most is that it completely broke my understanding of DPS. Not only does this thing have competitive total damage at 3 mil total, even without any damage super, it does 177,000 DPS, which is easily exceeding any rocket rotation that there is, which is just frankly amazing. Now this rotation is the same as the rank 4 rotation Horseman Overture Edge, it just opts for Parasite instead. Pretty simple, Parasite, Blade, swap to Raining Dance Machines, Horseman Dump, Mountaintop, and then a Cascade Bait and Switch Edge Transit Mag to finish it off. Now, this last one, I knew what was coming, you knew what was coming, that's right, Worm God Grapple melees at almost 221,000 DPS. Of course we kill the boss. If we killed with Synthos, of course we're going to kill with Worm Gods. As you can see in this clip, I have 4 to 5 stacks for basically the entire rotation, thanks to all these Harpies that are coming underneath Templar and dying to my Grapple melee. Infinitely sustainable. Yeah, I mean, there's not much to say about this. Enjoy watching the clip. And with that, we've wrapped up this little compilation of every single damage rotation that I think is relevant in Season 23. Now, going into Final Shape, obviously a lot of things are subject to change. Some of these rotations will become better, some of them will become worse or irrelevant, and as things change season on season, I'm going to try and keep this list updated with things and rotations that I think are interesting or relevant, while dropping the ones that are less interesting and probably are less applicable. So stuff like Cascade Deconstruct, for example, that's getting patched next season. So with that in mind, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, hope you learned something new, and I certainly did, right? That Horseman, that Concluso rotation with the Horseman and Dragon Shadow, that one really impressed me, for example, so I hope you guys felt the same way. And the next video is probably going to be talking about the weapon tuning update. A lot of you guys have been asking me, hey, Aegis, you know, the kinetic weapon bonus to unshielded targets is getting a change, you know, it's getting removed. What do you think? I will answer that in the next video, but yeah, stay tuned until then.